All right, let's go ahead and kick things off. Again, thank you for joining us today. I know this is a little bit of a time difference. We have some guests from the UK, so we're working in a different time zone here, which is awesome. And so I'm really excited to actually have this conversation. This is kind of the tail end of our mitigating bias and analytics series that we've been working on with Tableau. We've covered all different types of topics in this particular area, starting with data collection. We've talked about design, we've talked about algorithms, policies, standards, all around this concept of mitigating bias throughout the analytics process. So today is a really nice tie up of that conversation. We're going to be talking about storytelling and all of the complexities of telling really accurate and complex stories with data, and making sure throughout that process that we're being really conscious about mitigating any bias we might be inserting into that. So today we're going to be having a conversation, a fireside chat with Helen, and I'm really excited. But before we get started, I want to go over just a few administrative items, and then we will jump into the conversation. So just some quick items on the agenda. We're going to do some quick introductions of WIA and Tableau, and then I will introduce our two speakers today. And then for about 35 minutes, we're going to jump into the fireside chat where Tony's going to be talking to Helen about this topic. And then we will leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A with the audience. This is a really great opportunity for all of you to engage with the speakers that we have today. So as you start to think of ideas or questions, feel free to use the Q&A portion of the webinar, Zoom webinar at the bottom, and go ahead and fire away your questions throughout the entire conversation, and we will get to those towards the end. Finally, we're going to close things out and give you access or give you information on how to access the recording for this so you can share it with your friends and colleagues. And then afterwards, something that I really love because we are virtual, is an opportunity for all of us to be able to network and talk to each other. So we will have an optional networking portion at the end if you'd like to stick around and meet some of the other attendees for this event. So a little bit about the series. It's a free virtual series that we're hosting. We actually host a lot of webinar series like this on different topics. So if you did miss all the other 5 events in this series, feel free to go to our YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel name is Women in Analytics, so you can find it pretty easily there. And you'll see all the recordings for the previous events that we did for this series, so you can get all caught up. A little bit about WIA. Our mission is to increase visibility to the women making a significant impact in the analytics space. So we help facilitate discussions around conversations around the advancements of analytical research, development, and applications. We also have a membership platform and program, so feel free to go to our website, womeninanalytics.com, to learn more about that and stay engaged with us. A few items on webinar tips. So if you are having audio issues, then you definitely can't hear me right now. So feel free to chat or email us at info@womeninanalytics.com. Like I said, if you have questions, feel free to fire away throughout the entire process. We will get to those towards the end. And as I mentioned, if you're up for some networking, we sent you the link in the email prior to this webinar. So feel free to go back and reference that. I will also post it in the chat at the end. So you can just click that link and head over to the webinar or head over to the networking session. Okay, thanks for sticking with me through all the administrative items. Now we will get to the good stuff. So I want to introduce our speaker today and our host. We're really fortunate to have these two incredible women join us today. So thank you so much for spending some time prepping and getting ready for this session. First, I'm going to introduce Helen Pullet. She is the managing director at Arrows Up, an SEO and digital marketing consultancy, and formerly a university lecturer of web marketing and analytics. She has over a decade's experience working in digital marketing, specializing in SEO and Google Analytics. Welcome, Helen. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Nice to be able to speak to you all today.
And then our host is actually from Tableau. So Tony Farrell, a sales leader for over 15 years. Tony now leads the UKI mid-market team at Tableau. Passionate about all things data and supporting women in sales, Tony has a particular interest in data literacy for the non-technical user. Welcome, Tony, and thank you so much for hosting this conversation.
Thank you, Regan. It's great to be here. I'm just so excited to be representing Tableau as part of this, the Women in Analytics Partnership. For those of you who don't know who Tableau are or what we do, we help people to see and understand their data with our visual analytics platform. Personally, as Regna said, I'm really passionate about data literacy and advancing women in data and women in analytics. So it's really special for me to be here today. So thank you, and thanks to Helen for joining us. Great. So we'll kick off, Helen. I know we spent some time talking before today, and we were talking about the process that agencies or that you would go through when you're presenting stories and dashboards to your clients. And you mentioned to me about sometimes you have a hell week in getting ready for presenting to your clients. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Oh yes, hell week, absolutely. So what is common with a lot of marketing agencies is that at the beginning of the month, you will report on all of the data that you've collected over the previous month to discuss how well a campaign or a particular piece of marketing has performed. So that tends to take place within the first week of the month, hence why I call it Hell Week, because it is a hellish time where you are inundated with demands from clients who just want that update now. You've got managers who are asking you to really work quickly and get these reports out the door, and then you've got your own analysis that's having to take place. So it's an awful lot that just gets packed into that 1 week when you're trying to get these reports ready for clients. So that's why I call it Hell Week.
And I guess, do you find you do have all these, conflicts? So you've the conflicts of your managers who want a really positive report for the client. You've the client who wants to know that all their campaigns are being 100% successful. And then you've got your own integrity conflicting there, that you want to be honest with the client and tell them the best picture. I imagine that bias can then sometimes creep into your reports when you're trying to please everybody.
Absolutely. You have all of these pressures that are asking you to shape the narrative in a particular way, which might not necessarily be what the data is telling you. Starting at the end goal of pleasing the client, pleasing your managers, and working backwards, trying to find the data that actually proves that point. So it's almost an about-face way of analysing data. You're almost trying to find the data to prove the story that you want to tell, rather than using the data to form that story.
Okay, so what sort of questions then might you ask yourself when you're preparing these stories to ensure that you don't start with the story you want to tell, you actually tell the truth?
Absolutely. Whenever I'm coaching other people within teams or with agencies that I'm working with, it always is a case of looking at actually what's the positive that this data is telling me, but also what's the negative that this data is telling me. So, for instance, it might well be that it's not been that successful. But if you allow yourself to report on the negatives as well as the positives, it helps you to get in that frame of mind where it's a much more well-rounded story you're telling, rather than having it in your mind that you have to only show the positives, because that's what's going to keep your client happy and what's going to keep their budget coming into your agency. So actually giving yourself permission to talk about the whole story and understanding actually the negatives that might have been shown from the previous month's worth of data is just a starting point for you to improve from. It's not this is the worst thing that's happened and actually we're going to lose a client over this, but giving yourself that freedom to really explore the data. I think you have to do that right at the beginning so that you know that the story that you end up telling is going to be the total picture, not just the highlights.
Sure. And sometimes I imagine that you might see trends that look negative, but maybe there's something built in there, maybe seasonality or something that's affecting a trend negatively.
Absolutely, that happens all the time. Seasonality plays a huge part within marketing, and even things that are going on with society as a whole. The fact that this year has really messed with everyone's forecasting models because of a global pandemic, that will absolutely be reflected in the trends that you're seeing. But it could be, for instance, that you always notice a decrease in, say, visitors to your website towards December time. And if you're just showing a client a graph with that trend, it looks like everything's gone wrong that month. But actually, December might be a very quiet month for you because you are marketing to your B2B, marketing to businesses, and most businesses close down around December time because of the holidays. And actually, without that context, those kind of graphs can look quite alarming. And sometimes that can be an issue when you're trying to communicate that to a stakeholder.
Yeah, of course. And it's interesting that, you mentioned that area of context, how if you're sharing something with a client, how do you ensure that it is contextual, maybe with the dashboard, what it's showing, so that they don't jump off to a conclusion that is wrong?
Absolutely. I annotate everything I can. That's always my go-to, because I always think I might have the opportunity to say, run through the report with a client at the beginning of the month. But by the end of the month, when they're looking over that report again, they might well have forgotten everything, and they're back to just looking at that graph that's got a nasty downward trend towards it. So I like to annotate things. I like to put stuff into perspective. So for instance, if I've noticed that traffic has decreased to the website in December, what did that look like to the previous December? Is it a seasonal trend? If it is, can I comment on that in some way? Have we noticed there's been less of a decline this year than there is in previous years, in which case that's progress. But by annotating it, I can help the client to really see at a glance that pertinent information that otherwise might just get missed as they're panicking over a downward trend in their graph that they're seeing.
Yeah, it's really important to add that context. And I imagine also that it's really important to know your customer, and to know who your client is, what's important to them, and even, you know, to the data literacy point that I spoke of earlier, you know, understanding how data literate they are. Maybe they're not used to looking at reports in a certain way.
Absolutely. It's marketing for me is as much about knowing the end user of product or services that you're marketing, but also knowing your audience in terms of those reports. So your stakeholders, what do they know about analytics? What do they know about marketing? A lot of companies that I will work with have had previous agencies in the past that have worked with them that perhaps have trained them to look at data in a certain way, or trained them to be very keen on certain data points that actually aren't necessarily going to reveal that much to them. And because of that, there's some re-education that has to take place. But oftentimes, you don't have that opportunity, especially if you've got an hour or two to write a report every month, and that's it. So it's about trying to communicate that data in a way that they are going to be able to see at a glance what's important for them to know. Hence the annotations, I find that very useful. And also just writing commentary. I find that to be really crucial. Part of the reason my clients hire me is because they want my expert opinion on a piece of marketing or something, a campaign that we're working on. And so I feel like it's my responsibility to provide that expert opinion within the analysis of the data as well. Because a lot of the data points that I'm reporting on are ones that they have available to them, but they're not necessarily ones that they would be able to extrapolate that insight from themselves without that guiding hand. So a lot of the time it's about understanding, what do they know? What do they know about marketing? What do they know about data analytics? What do they know? And what gaps can I help fill there?
And have you experienced any time that, you know, stakeholders have jumped to conclusions when they've seen a particular data point?
Yes, every time.
Or maybe they weren't, maybe incomplete or incorrect, I guess.
Absolutely, all the time. And particular specialism of mine, search engine optimization, part of what I do is help websites to migrate from, say, an old design of a website to a new design of a website without losing visibility in the search engines. Now, that often is a bit of a tumultuous period of time, and I always will warn clients beforehand. You might see a drop in visibility, for instance, but nonetheless, whenever that report comes around and I show them actually that they've had quite a good maintenance of that visibility, they see a slight dip, that's when the panic sets in. And so no matter how much you kind of try to prepare a client for that, they still see the downward trend in the graph, and that's where they worry. So I think the beauty of data visualization is it can be seen in a snapshot what's going on, but equally the nuance and the context can be lost because of that. So I think it's definitely something that I faced before. And really it's about explaining it to clients, it's explaining it to your stakeholders, exactly what does that graph mean. And if you can, try to include some kind of context within the graph. So for instance, a year-on-year visualization, so that you can see, yes, there was a dip, but it happens every year. Yes, we see this pattern quite regularly where there's a drop in traffic, but it rises again a month later. That kind of thing that you can use to help reassure them then, and that they can see at a glance themselves that that it's not a critical issue that they've just discovered.
Yeah, sure. And I guess you know, generally when we're working with data and we're in the industries we're in, we've kind of seen the good, the bad, and the ugly of all sorts of reports. What are the biggest mistakes maybe that you've often seen in storytelling as part of your role?
Cherry picking data. It goes back to that issue of actually there's a lot of pressure on marketers to be able to report positive results. And because of that, oftentimes when you are perhaps working as a consultant, so you're a consultancy or an agency, very, very keen to show your worth. And as a result of that, just cherry pick what looks like good metrics to show that there's been an increase in something, so that a client can go away with a nice green upwards pointing arrow to show that something's improved, and they don't really look into all those negative red pointing down arrows that are showing that things aren't going well. And I think it's that trying to highlight those small wins to try and smooth over the fact that there's been a lot of losses is a massive issue for a lot of marketing reports that I've seen. And rather than going through that process of saying, well, actually, it's been a really bad month, we've had some really negative results, but we know why and we know what we need to do to improve it, which would be a much better story to tell overall than trying to hide the fact that that's happened and try and disguise it with the odd little positive metric that you can pick out and make a big deal out of.
Yeah, so it's that balance about wanting your clients to walk away with a warm fuzzy feeling about things, rather than actually wanting them to walk away with the truth of where we're at and our actions and next points that we can do to improve on where we are.
Absolutely. I think there's a lot of fear, unfortunately, with marketing agencies, especially at the moment, because a lot of budgets are being paused or being cut altogether because of current economic situations, that it's hard to be completely truthful within those sorts of reports. And I think a lot of marketing agencies struggle with that because they just want to show positives. They want to show growth. They want to highlight the good work they've been doing. And sometimes the data doesn't necessarily show the good work that you've been doing. A lot of marketing campaigns can be quite slow, actually, and it can take quite a while for you to see the fruit of your labour. And if the data isn't quite showing that yet, I can understand that temptation to try and make it look a bit more positive than it currently is.
Yeah, but fudge the numbers a little bit, as we spoke earlier on today.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not what we want to do, right? We want to use data for good and use it to empower people to make better decisions.
Absolutely. I think that, to me, is that integrity bit of, I know the work that I'm doing is good, even if the results haven't quite gotten there yet. It's about talking about the journey. This is the work that we've been doing. This is the impact it's had so far, and this is what I predict it's going to be doing in a month or two's time. I don't need to show you just the positive highlights, because you just need to trust me as your expert advisor, your trusted advisor, that I know what I'm doing. The results will be there eventually, even if they're not quite there yet. Especially in the midst of current circumstances where it's very hard to predict anything. People aren't acting as they have traditionally acted in the past. New ways of working, new ways of thinking are developing this year that we've not seen before. And because of that, campaigns might not run as smoothly as they initially would have done a few months ago, a few years ago. So we're kind of having to iterate and try and test things. And as a result of that, the data might not be instantly as positive as we've seen in the past, but you need to trust that it will get there. And it's no benefit to anyone if you try and fudge those numbers, because eventually the truth will be quite apparent when ROI isn't there or marketing budgets just can't be increased. So it's better to be very, very honest with your stakeholders, so that they're in the journey with you, and you can support each other through that period that might be a bit more tumultuous than you're used to.
For sure. And I think, as you say, at the now more than ever, data is more important than ever, because we need to see what's going on. We need to emerge from this pandemic and be able to grow. And the only way we can do that, as you refer to, is with our trusted advisors. And at Tableau as well, we want to be that trusted advisor to our clients and offer the correct data. And yes, it's not always what you want to see, but let's get to the step where we can come out of this and see growth again. We spoke a little bit there about, maybe misleading data or misleading visuals. And I suppose now more than ever, we're all watching the news and there's dashboards all over the place. We've all been more exposed to dashboards than ever. Have you seen any examples recently in public or on the news of perhaps misleading data?
Absolutely. Anything to do with coronavirus, it feels. There's a graph or a chart that you look into with a bit more skepticism and realize it's not actually telling you quite what it appears to be telling you. There's one that was actually going around the social media networks recently for the UK. There was a heat map of coronavirus cases in the UK, and it was a side-by-side graph, one from a few months ago, one from very recently, and it was a colour scale that when you looked at the two maps side by side, it looked like actually there hadn't been that much of an increase in coronavirus cases at all. But it wasn't until you actually looked at the scale that was being used that you realised that actually the banding has changed between those two charts. And for very good reasons. I think essentially if they hadn't changed the banding, everything would have just been one colour because coronavirus cases had increased. But at first glance, it looked like they hadn't really. So the visualization wasn't really telling the whole story unless you knew to look at things like the scale to see actually what was being measured and what was being charted there. So those kind of graphs are around all the time at the moment. A lot of people, potentially news outlets that don't quite understand how to properly visualize data, are just trying to put stuff together, perhaps to further their own narrative and not necessarily to always communicate as clearly as possible. So yes, it's out there a lot at the moment.
Yeah, exactly. And that's, having that own narrative that you're trying to convey rather than what the actual truth is. Again, that's how the bias creeps into through that storytelling piece. I know we spoke previously when we were preparing for this about different types of data sets and how they might influence reporting, particularly for you in digital marketing. Can you talk a little bit about that and what sort of data sets maybe you would love to see or love to have access to when you're creating your stories?
Absolutely. When we're in digital marketing, the kind of data sets that we have access to are things like statistics for your website, so traffic to your website, that sort of thing. If you're working within paid media, you might have access to some of those platforms' own analytics and insights. But at the end of the day, it's actually quite limited, and there's always flaws in that data that is being collected. A lot of what I do within search engine optimization is trying to get an understanding of what users are searching for when they're using search engines like Google or Bing, for instance. But even that data isn't entirely accurate. And so you're kind of working with data sets that aren't entirely valid, aren't entirely integral. And because of that, you're working with numbers that aren't necessarily telling you the full story. So ideally, I'd love access to things like information about what's going on in society, because that, of course, will determine how users are searching for things. It would determine user behavior, it determines audience intent. Depending on the type of product or service that I might be marketing, there's a whole host of different data points to be useful. If I am, for instance, marketing clothing, it'd be really interesting to get insight into forecasting of weather. If you can have access to that data, then that is absolutely going to inform how I would market a particular company's products at that moment in time. Or perhaps you happen to sell something like outdoor furniture or sheds, garden sheds, that kind of thing. Again, understanding what the weather's going to be like over the next month, few weeks even, will determine how people are likely to start buying outdoor furniture and whether they're going to be investing in sheds, that sort of thing. So that extra data point can be incredibly valuable, but it's not necessarily something that I'd have to hand most of the time. Equally, information about stocks and shares, for instance, or what's going on in terms of the economy would be incredibly valuable. As a marketing consultant, it's not normally the data set that you would be able to access. It would take partnerships with other organisations to be able to get that information with any sort of real integrity. So yes, all kinds of data would be useful, but often we're working with very limited data sets. Normally stuff that's been set up by the marketing agency itself. Potentially the client will have data sets that they are maintaining, but oftentimes it's not quite a full enough picture for you to really get that level of insight that would be valuable.
And what do you think are the main barriers to getting that sort of information? So you mentioned maybe you might have to have a partnership with someone else to get access to that. What would that look like for you?
Oftentimes, I think the real barrier is actually time and money. I'm sure there are agencies out there that absolutely could form those kind of partnerships, but it's not open to everyone by any means, because oftentimes marketing agencies are a place of a lot of work and not quite enough bodies to do the work. So being able to spend time actually trying to create those partnerships and foster those partnerships and identifying what additional data sets would be useful is just out of the scope of many people working within that industry, because they simply don't have the time. Oftentimes there might be data available to the clients themselves, so large corporations will have a wealth of data at their fingertips that they perhaps aren't using effectively at the moment, or they are using effectively, but they're not passing on to their marketing partner who would also benefit from that information. So again, it's a case of identifying what data sets are available and can you get hold of them. CRMs are often a gold mine of information for marketers because it's that half of the picture you don't often get to see. Marketing is all about getting eyeballs onto your website or onto your product or services, getting people familiar with your brand, but you don't often get to see what's happened the other end when people are actually getting in touch with the brand. How are they communicating? What are their questions? What issues do they have? Why do refunds happen? Why do returns happen? That kind of thing. And that level of data, again, will absolutely help inform people who are working at getting that marketing campaign off the ground or getting it to convert well. But it's data that often companies will not know to share, or it's something actually that's got quite a lot of sensitive data in, so they can't necessarily share it without, again, investing in cleansing that data to make it available to outside parties.
Sure. And do you think that maybe this also links back a little bit to data literacy? So if your clients or your company, they don't realize that this data is important because they're not using the data every single day, so they just don't put two and two together?
I think so, absolutely, especially for smaller organizations that perhaps don't have people dedicated to analyzing the data themselves or maintaining those databases. It's not their job, it's not something that they do on the day-to-day, so they just don't know how valuable it is. Or perhaps they do understand the value of it, they just don't have the time to be able to package it up in a way that it can be shared with another agency. Oftentimes when you're working with very small organizations, the person who is the point person for marketing within the company is also the point person for finance and HR and a few other things as well. So actually taking a step back and thinking, this data that I have in my hands here, the access that I have, is going to be so useful for my marketing partner. It's just not something that they've been able to do. Absolutely. Or even just the fact that there are so many rules and regulations around data sharing that makes it quite tricky to share outside of your organization sometimes.
Yeah, and I think it's that they probably don't even realize that it will be important to their marketing partner. And I suppose I'm lucky enough to work in a data company. So, you know, why I'm so passionate about data literacy is because I came from a background that wasn't technical, that I didn't know much about data. And I've been afforded the luxury of having training and working with data every day to get me to a point where I am now data literate. And I would just love to see companies allowing people that time and the resources to just go and play with data, you know, just have a safe place that's governed. I mean, when I first started playing with data, I was afraid I'd break something or someone would laugh at what my dashboard looked like. But, you know, when you're surrounded by people who want you to succeed and want you to become data literate, it's such a good feeling. And to have sandboxes online where you can play with data, you know, and I think unless we encourage data literacy, we won't see companies becoming true data companies because they don't offer the resources, I guess.
Absolutely. A lot of the time, I think they have the understanding that they have data. They might even be at the stage where they're using that data to a degree, but they're not using it to its fullest. And I absolutely agree with you that education around data literacy is so important. I've had the opportunity of lecturing at a university, teaching master's students about marketing and analytics. And the first time that they opened up the Google Analytics program and looked at the website visitor data to a large company's website, their eyes just lit up because they just had no understanding this data was actually available to analyze. And it was incredibly enjoyable watching them use it for the first time and start to see the level of information they could get, that they were able actually to pinpoint particular types of people who were visiting the website, or the fact that they could understand more about how users are engaging with the website is completely novel to them. And unfortunately, I think that's the case in a lot of organizations, that actually even marketers themselves don't necessarily know quite what data they have on hand and what level of insight it can give them. Yeah,
absolutely. So you are a very busy lady, Helen. Not only are the MD of Arrows Up, you're also lecturing at the University of Kent, isn't that correct? For their
Yes, I just finished lecturing there, so that was incredibly enjoyable experience.
Amazing. What would be, you know, your best advice for someone who is going out and going to be presenting insights on data or their story? What would be your best advice to someone?
Probably to know your audience, so understand who your stakeholders are. Who is this report going to? What do they know? Because that needs to be your starting point. I've seen it too many times where I've had members of a team send over a report to one of their clients and then jump on a call with the client and say, was there anything about the report that you didn't understand? They say, I didn't even read it, because it wasn't conveyed in a way that made them want to actually read the report, or if the report was too long, or the data that they were presenting just wasn't relevant. It wasn't matching up with the KPIs that they personally are monitoring for their own role within the organisation. And so the report to them was just a time waste that they just couldn't afford. So really, my advice is really get to know who your stakeholders are for those reports, who is going to be reading them, and what are they interested in. If they have a particular metric that they consider to be very important because it's something a previous agency used to report on a lot, help them to tell you what that is so that you can start including that in your reports, but alongside potentially more valuable metrics that are going to help them more, so that the data that they are reading is going to resonate with them. Otherwise, you're just giving them sheets of information that is just numbers or graphs, and there's no relevance to them there. It's got to be a report that actually adds value to their day, that helps them do their job with more insight. And if it doesn't do that, then most people are too busy to just be looking through a report that you've produced for your own benefit, really, rather than theirs.
Yeah, for sure. And yeah, I mean, as you say, knowing your client and what they're interested in, because, you know, we spoke about giving your clients positive reports because you think that's what they want to see. But if you're giving them a report that they're not interested in, and it's reams and reams of paper, you're not going to keep them for a client for very long, are you?
No, absolutely not, because you're not actually meeting their needs at all. It shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what they need from you and what they're expecting from you. And in the worst case scenario, it could show them that you don't understand the industry at all, which is absolutely not what you want as a trusted advisor.
For sure. And Helen, do you, you're talking about industries and knowing their industry, do you specialize in particular industry, or, how do you skill yourself up to know all the various different industries that are out there?
I often learn on the job, essentially. So part of my induction and onboarding process with new clients is really asking those pertinent questions about their industry. A lot of my first steps when I'm working with them is auditing and looking at competitors and getting a real deep dive into how users are interacting with their particular website, or what sort of audience they're working with. And through that, get to know a lot more about their industry. But you are never going to know as much as the person that you are working for when you're at an agency. They are always the people with the absolute in-depth knowledge of their industry. So for me, it's very much about that communication between you and your client, so that you can keep picking their brains, you can keep understanding what it is that they are working on day in, day out, so that you can kind of use their information in a way that's going to benefit their marketing.
Sure, excellent. So we've gone through a lot of questions there, I think, Helen, and loads of excellent advice. And there are so many ways. I think we're all, we all have conflicting pressures on us, as you talked about, the conflicting pressures from what your client wants to hear, from your management who want to continue to have this client, and from yourself wanting to make sure that you're upholding your integrity. You spoke about getting to know your audience and who your clients are, and how that trust is really, really important, and building up that honest, trust-based relationship with your client. Would you feel that's one of the most important things to be successful, not just from a data storytelling point of view, but from your point of view with your client?
Absolutely. For me, trust is important in any relationship, especially with clients, because at the end of the day, they are giving you money to do a job. So if you're going to be an expert advisor to them, you need to kind of show that in a way that means something to them. And honestly, for me, it's that communication, it's that sharing the highs and lows with them. That's what builds that trust. If you are only ever sugarcoating the message, then you aren't going to, you're never going to win their trust, because the second they get a little bit skeptical of that, start digging into things themselves, the data themselves, it's just going to raise a lot of questions. But if you've already been honest and you've explained that this month's been a particularly bad month, but here's what you've learned from it, then you're already showing them that you're with them on that journey, and that you're not looking to pull the wool over their eyes just to keep the money coming in, but actually you care and are invested in their business and making their business great.
For sure. And Helen, before we move on to some questions and answers from our audience, which is great to see some of the questions already coming in, is there any closing statements that you'd like to, or words of wisdom you'd like to pass on to our audience today?
Oh, I think probably my best words of wisdom for people who are either new to the industry or looking to get into the industry, and that is to always be curious. Always be curious. But I've noticed myself, as I have moved up within agencies, or I've moved from an agency to another agency, that it's very, very easy for you to just fall into the way of doing things that that particular agency or you were taught to do something, and you stop being curious because you just start going through the motions. But actually question, is this the best way to display this data? Is there better data that we could be using? Am I telling an accurate story? Why am I being asked to not tell an accurate story? And start questioning that sort of thing. And it helps you to be much more proficient within any industry, I'd say, but especially when you're looking at analysing and reporting on data.
Sure, I think that's great advice. And, you know, remaining curious, you know, I think it was actually Richard Branson said, you know, we don't hire intelligent people and tell them what to do. We hire intelligent people so they can tell us what to do. So I think that's great. If you're talking about, it is easy sometimes when you join a company that the pressure of wanting to perform or do something, you just do something in a certain way rather than having that curiosity and coming up with those new ideas. So I think that's absolutely excellent advice. So thank you for that, Helen. And thank you for joining us today. And back over to you, Reagan, for some questions, I think.
Awesome. Yes. Thank you both so much for that great conversation. I think, Helen, you outlined a lot of individual components to think about as you're going through that process of analyzing data, putting a story together, presenting it to your stakeholders. I know I have a bunch of questions, and I'm sure the audience does as well. I'm going to start with a question around like integrity. We talked about data literacy, but in my experience, I think one of the biggest problems I've seen in the storytelling process is this ability to convey data quality concerns, context, make sure people are on the same wavelength of what this means. How do you prepare that kind of information or annotation around what you're presenting? Because a lot of misperception or incorrect conclusions are really driven from not understanding the underlying data and the quality concerns there.
Absolutely, very much agree. I think a lot of the time is, again, this having a conversation with your stakeholder. Actually, this is the data set we're working from, but here are its flaws. This is why we're not necessarily going to be able to give you a 100% accurate picture of what's going on. Here is where it's more likely to be a trend that we're analysing rather than specific actual hard data that we're analysing, and really having that communication around what they understand the data to be and what you know it is. Because it is very easy for people to just assume you're getting some data from a program or a set of data sets and it must be accurate. But actually we know what goes into cleansing those data sets and the inaccuracies that can become part of those, and really it's communicating that. Because at the end of the day, you're absolutely right. You can present a report, it can be annotated, you can have the context in there, but if the underlying data has flaws, then that report needs to reflect that.
Yeah, and oftentimes too, you know, going through this process of quality, I think a lot of times this ethical consideration or even like bias is not really considered a quality check right before it goes out the door, before we start building these dashboards. Is there anything, I know one of the questions from the audience was around this as well, but is there any, you know, tips or specific processes that you go through when you're looking at data sets to ensure, you know, where might bias have been inserted into this process? Can I highlight that in a way that my stakeholders are going to understand? And was there ever a point that you're like, this is just not usable and you have to deliver that bad news?
Yes, unfortunately there is. Oftentimes particular data sets that are prevalent within digital marketing often have quite inherent flaws in them because of the data collection method. The data that's being reported on, and it will be the same type of data that's reported on most marketing agencies, actually isn't 100% accurate. And it's something as marketers we know about, but often that's just not communicated to the client. So in terms of trying to mitigate that bias, I have a couple of processes that I tend to go through. Once I've analysed the data and I've written a summary of what I think it says, I take a step back and try to look at, actually, am I trying to prove a point somewhere? And that's quite something that's quite difficult for you to do objectively. So often I'll also give it to someone else to look at, so a colleague to look at and say, actually, am I being objective here, or is there bias here? In agencies that I've worked in where I've had a team that have been reporting into me, oftentimes all of those reports would funnel through me so I could do that check for them and can send it back and say, actually, I don't know that's the right data that you need to be highlighting right now, because I think you're trying to prove a point here rather than really analyze the data. and it's having that second pair of eyes that perhaps are a little bit more objective than you to have a look through and try and point out that bias for you. Because oftentimes it's hard for us to challenge our own bias. We don't always know that we've got bias. And sometimes it does require someone else to point that out to you, especially when it's a data set that perhaps you're very familiar with, or you've just got a real invested interest in portraying that data in a certain way.
Yeah, it sounds like peer review and getting somebody to kind of cross-check your work is really important. And this is actually a theme that's come up in every single event that we've done in the series, which is having diverse teams with diverse backgrounds and diverse perspectives and experiences to be able to highlight those types of things that maybe we don't know as we're going through that analysis process. So 2 questions stemming from that. Number 1, is there any particular criteria around that mindset of trying to be as objective as possible, in addition to challenging mindset you mentioned earlier when you're hiring or when you're actually going to potentially another agency? So that's the 1 question. And then the second one is, do you really push the envelope of navigating organizational structures of your clients to make sure you've got a diverse perspective of their industry within their company as well?
Really good questions, very good questions. I think speaking to the diversity within hiring question, I think that is fundamental. And I think that's something that we are just waking up to in 2020, unfortunately. It's something that hasn't been considered enough over previous years, but thankfully it is much more in discussion now. But very much so. I think that diversity in hiring is important for every aspect of business, but very much so when you are trying to analyze and tell a story, because if everyone around the table who you are asking to peer check your work for you is of a similar background to you, then you're not going to probably be able to spot the bias anyway, because they might hold the same bias as you. So actually having a diverse group of people around you who can actually speak to that bias is really important. In terms of making sure that the companies that you're working with have a diverse structure is hard. It's very hard to do. You don't often get access to everyone within the company, or you, especially when you are consulting for a company, you might have one person that you liaise with on the day-to-day and very little understanding of other people that sit within the team, or perhaps you don't have any communication with the people that sit within their team. And so being able to separate their bias from the information that they're telling you is also very, very tricky, and requires you to do a lot of research around it to make sure that the information they are telling you about their industry or particular challenges they're having or their own audience isn't in itself biased by them. So whenever possible, I will try to get the points of view of a few people from the organisation, but obviously as a consultant, I have no say over their hiring practices and the diversity that they have within their own organisation. So sometimes it's a case of working with what I've got and then trying to cross-check that with external sources.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I'm sure there's probably some sort of conversations you can have with your client too, giving them understanding of the amount of benefits that they would get on including other stakeholders and other people within their organization with your project. But to your point, that it becomes a cost thing for a lot of people, and they don't want to wrap up more resources and those types of projects. So it becomes very challenging to try to push that. We've got a couple of other questions from the audience. So actually one that I was looking at as well, or that I had thought of as well. This says, when interviewing, if I'm open about mining and cleaning data for the purpose of truth telling, could that potentially hurt my chance of getting hired?
Oh, that's a really good question. I really hope it wouldn't. I actually hope it would improve your chances of getting hired, because it really shows integrity, and it shows that you're willing to question things and you're willing to challenge things. And for me, when I've been hiring people, that's the kind of mindset that I want. I want someone who is going to challenge what I'm telling them, because I want them to be thinking independently, and I want to know that they're curious and they're wanting to learn and develop and grow. So I'd like to say that no, it wouldn't hinder your chances of being hired, but it very much, unfortunately, depends on the organisation that you're interviewing with, because some won't necessarily want you to challenge the status quo. They won't want you to upset the apple cart. They want you to just do the job as they've defined it, with the data the way they've set it. But then I guess your question, is that the kind of organisation that you want to be working for anyway?
I was just going to say that. It's probably a really good question, or a really good piece of information you can wean out of an organization to see what kind of culture they have. It may not be a great organization for you to work for if they don't like you telling the truth.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I have another question. So it says, if I'm looking to transition from a design background into marketing analytics, what is a way to highlight transferable skills to stand out on my resume?
Oh, brilliant. I would probably look at some of the projects that you've been involved with. So perhaps if you have been designing collateral for a marketing campaign, or you've been involved in website design, for instance, start talking about the projects that has been a part of. And whilst you're in that process of wanting to move across, try and in the organization that you're in, try to ask questions of those other teams. Try and get a little bit more involved where you can, so that you can start picking up some idea of what is involved in their projects and what they're doing on the day-to-day, because that's the kind of thing that you can talk about at interview then. I think whenever you're trying to move industries, it's always important that you can try and show some kind of experience in the new industry, even if it's voluntary, to show that you've got an understanding of what that new industry entails and that you are up for the challenge. So moving from design into more of a marketing analytics role is about finding where those teams cross over in your current job and seeing whether you can start to talk more with those colleagues and get a bit more understanding about what they're up to. And if possible, try and help them out if you're allowed. If you're able to take on a little bit of their work sort of on a voluntary learning basis, just to get to grips with what they're doing, try that.
Yeah, you echoed something one of our speakers in our previous series talked about, Jacqueline Nullis, who wrote a book about getting started into data science and building your career. She said the same thing. If you can find someone within your organization or somebody who's working on that, see if you can help them in any way, even if it's just doing some data cleansing or something like that, just to get involved in the process. So I think that's a wonderful answer. Another question we have, so I work in non-digital marketing analytics and I encounter the same resistance to bad news. Did you find that some companies handle bad news better, and what is the difference about those companies?
Oh, definitely, some do. Some clients I've had in the past have been very, very adverse to bad news. They only want to hear the highlights. They don't want the bad news, unfortunately. I think it goes back to that literacy piece, whether it's data literacy and they understand more about what data is and how to handle it properly, or whether it's their understanding of marketing and how that ebbs and flows. If they don't fully understand what you are doing when you are giving them information, so they don't understand your specialism, they don't understand the work that you've been carrying out, bad news is always going to hit hard because they're not expecting it. But if they have more of an understanding of what you do, they have more of an understanding of the risks involved in it or the complexities, then they are more likely to be understanding when that hard news hits. So part of what I do when I onboard new clients is give them very basic training in the marketing that I do. So they understand the risks that are involved. They understand those pain points. They understand when I say it's going to take a few months before we see a positive result here, they understand why. So the more you can educate people, the easier it'll be for them to join you in the journey and not just expect miracles when you can't provide them.
Yeah, I think that's excellent. And that actually touched on one of my other questions too, which is like, what kind of prep work can you do to kind of soften the blow for those types of conversations? Can you set expectations up front and give people that, that upfront conversation where it's like, I'm going to probably deliver some bad news at some point, but it's an opportunity for us to improve and we can focus on that. I think it's all about setting expectations to some degree. I have a little bit different of a question. Maybe Tony, you can jump in on this particular question as well. When you're creating these dashboards or reports, I know especially with Tableau, you can make those like public links, or you can make them live and you can send the links to people, and you've got all of this context and annotation and data quality concerns. How do you persist that and make that available so that when they go to their team and they're like, check out this dashboard I just got from my consultant, they have all the context they need? Because I often find it's a game of telephone at some point, the context lose all meaning. And this is what we're seeing with COVID dashboards in the news, right? Somebody's building it. We don't know what data they used. We don't know what quality concerns there are or definitions. So how do you handle the persistence of that context and annotation and quality? And maybe Helen, you can talk about that from your experience, and then Tony, your experience being at Tableau, how Tableau might do that.
So from my perspective, it's very much about keeping the data and the annotations together wherever possible. So whenever I report on something, there is going to be annotations within that data set. So the visualization will be annotated itself so that it can't be separated. They can't send on that report without my annotations and my commentary there. The real difficulty comes when the client is looking at the data set themselves. So rather than looking specifically at my report, they might be analysing the data themselves and drawing conclusions that I haven't drawn. That's the real difficulty. So I think, again, it's around having that relationship with your stakeholder, that you have an internal champion at their company. Because for me, I often have one person that I will liaise with at the company. If we've had enough conversations, we've had enough honest conversations about the data that I'm reporting on, that they understand it. If someone comes to them from within their organisation and questions that data, they probably won't come to me, they'll come to that contact, that contact is able to explain it just like I would explain it. And that way, if they then become your face within the organisation, there's going to be a lot more trust built within that organisation, because one of their own is explaining it just like I would explain it.
I think you're on mute, Tony.
Sorry. From a Tableau perspective, we have a lot of things that we use internally. One of those is certified data sources. So we kind of stamp them with a star and it says, this is a certified data source. This has been cleansed by the correct people. It's governed. It is safe to use. Go do what you want with this data source. We also have data cleanliness warnings. So if something has happened to, maybe the data source hasn't refreshed, maybe there's been a problem in the background, it will flash up and say, this data is not clean, and just so that you're aware then that there could be issues with that particular data source. And I think as well, to Helen's point about annotating the data, so we would do that all the time within our visualizations. We would have comment bars on the side saying, I see this data point, or I see it's showing this, and we would maybe ask follow-on questions, and we're able to kind of build that conversation within the visualization itself, and then people can see the questions that have been asked of it. And so I think it's adding that context all the way along, and just creating that data culture of, these are safe governed data sources, it's okay for you to go and use that. And then as well, on top of that, it's always asking the second and third and fourth levels of why. Why are we seeing this data point? What's behind it? Is there another way to look at this? Is this as black and white as it appears, that profits up but sales are down, or what's happening? And it's just asking why, and just keeping getting to those. Sometimes you look at a data source and exactly what it is that you're looking for, but through analyzing it more deeply, you get to those unknowns, which are the things you didn't even think about at the beginning.
Yeah, I love that. And a big piece of asking that question too is, like, oftentimes this idea of mitigating bias, and this idea of ensuring that people are drawing conclusions that are as close to the truth as possible. It sounds like such a grand thing to try to tackle, and, like, in some sense it's kind of abstract. And so if we can start to solidify how to operationalize that a little bit more, it might become a better, more usable practice in a lot of organizations. So it sounds like, when you're talking about data quality, this hasn't been cleansed, or is there another flag we can put in place to start monitoring and tracking areas in which bias might be inserted into that process for that data set, because it's going to persist all the way through to the storytelling process. I always talk about, like, this whole analytics life cycle, and the fact that you're trying to take something that's happening in reality, which is very complex, and then you're trying to capture it in some way. So there's a context loss there, right? And you're deciding what to capture and when during the data collection process. And then you're going through some cleansing, and you're making more decisions and more assumptions and more context loss. And then you take that and you put it into a dashboard, which inevitably provides more context loss. So I think it's all about figuring out, are we, what are the risks here? Where are we losing context? How can we persist that throughout the process, and at least give some visibility and guidance to people who are using this data to make decisions, some confidence, some level of confidence. So yeah, those are all, wonderful points. And I'm glad that we touched on that too, just to kind of tie this all together. There's a couple of kind of hiring questions that I want to ask from the audience too, because while we have both of you women on this call, I think it's great to take advantage of your minds and get some feedback from that. So Number one, this says, any tips on how to gain experience in analytics when I've just completed a certification and my past experience is very diverse. Many entry-level jobs are requiring 2 to 5 years of experience, even a master's degree.
That's tricky. That's so tricky. And it's a case of a lot of jobs at the moment. There's a lot of people within various industries who are looking for jobs and not enough jobs for them. So the requirements to get a foot in the door at those jobs are just increasing. I think in terms of getting experience with analytics, I can speak very much from a digital marketing point of view. Set up your own website, for one. Start getting traffic to your site. Hook it up with various analytics programs. Suddenly you've got a data set that you can absolutely play with yourself. You can experiment, you can carry out changes to the website and see how that affects user engagement. You can start manipulating things to see how the data responds to that. So there's nothing stopping you getting your own data set, essentially. And setting up a website does not have to be expensive. In fact, it can be very, very, very cost effective to do, and it gets you that data that you can then talk about. And especially if you are looking to move more towards marketing analytics, that's the kind of thing the hiring managers love, to see that you've taken that initiative and actually started something yourself, and you've seen it grow to an extent. So that's one way that you can start getting involved with data. The other is potentially volunteering your time. Organizations might not know that they need someone to help them with data cleansing. Charities, for instance, it might be something they've never considered, but you might be able to approach charities that you like working with, you'd like to work with, and perhaps offer your services and just ask them whether it's something that they might like you to help them out with. Obviously, be fairly sure of your own ability to do that before you kind of let yourself loose on other people's data. But perhaps it's something that you could do for someone voluntarily for a bit, just to build up that experience and confidence in yourself and your abilities before you then start trying to apply for jobs.
I think that's a great idea, Helen. Another area is, also use one word, community. And at Tableau, we have the most amazing community. There's so much available for free out there, you know, not just from Tableau, but from all of the data communities that are out there. There's so much available for free that you can do, that you can, you know, as Helen referred to, building up your levels of experience. Get out there and experience the community, see what other people are doing. These people are data enthusiasts. They will only be too happy to help someone else out or comment on maybe something that you've created. There's even things, there's Data for Good, there's Makeover Mondays. They're another amazing community venture that we have at Tableau, run by one of our Zen masters. They give everyone a data set on a Monday, and you make over the data set and create something new and present it back, and you'll get commentary on what you've created, and you could even win Makeover Monday. So all of those things within the community are fantastic ways of getting your experience levels up.
Yeah, I love both of those things. I think it's really just, the more you can carve out time to engage and get tangible experience, the better. And to Tony's point, communities are really, really great for that, giving you opportunities to do that. I know when COVID hit, I volunteered some of my time to help my local food pantry, to help them kind of optimize where they can put resources and make sure that people were still getting access to that. So yeah, there's lots of opportunities out there to get involved for sure. Awesome. So one follow-up question, Tony, for you real quick. They said, how do you join those, Makeover Monday and others? How can they find more information about that? So
Tableau Public, just Google Tableau Public. It is, you'll find it. You can't miss it. It's huge. We've over 1 million members of Tableau Public. Makeover Monday, again, it's run by one of our Zen masters called Andy Kriebel. And if you Google Makeover Monday, you'll find it really easy. I'm sure we can issue some links maybe at the end in the follow-up if we're sending an email out.
Yeah, for sure. I'm happy to include that. Awesome. So I know we have about a minute left. So thank you both so much for being a part of this conversation and sharing your knowledge with everyone today. Before we head out, a couple of things. Number one, I'm about to send you the link for the networking session. If you're interested in joining us, feel free to click that. If once you click it, it's going to take you right out of this webinar and into that networking session. So just so you know, so I will send that in just a second. The second thing is, if you're interested in joining Women in Analytics, feel free to go to our website, womeninanalytics.com, and sign up for our newsletter or join us as a member. So that's a really easy way to get involved with our community. In addition to that, we do have an event coming up on October 22nd. It is our virtual data gallery. It is also sponsored by Tableau. These are the top finalists for our data visualization competition. In fact, they're all in different time zones from around the world. So it's going to be an absolutely incredible event. If you're interested in understanding how they built their final projects, you can join us for an hour and a half. They're going to deep dive into each one of those projects, and then you'll get to vote on who gets the prize money and wins the competition. So if you're interested in joining us, again, feel free to go to our website. You'll find the event there and you can register for free. And with that, I'm going to send the networking link in the chat. If you click that, it's going to take you out and put you into the networking link. Make sure to copy paste it, because as soon as I end this, this will be gone. So if you are interested in attending, here's your chance to copy paste it. Any final words, Helen or Tony, for the audience here today?
I just want to say thank you all very much for joining us today. It's been awesome being able to talk to you about my perspective on analytics, and yeah, thank you for having me.
Awesome.
Yeah, absolutely the same. Thank you. It's been great to be here, and thanks, Helen, for answering everything so honestly. You got loads of questions thrown at you, so we really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you both so much, and hopefully we'll see you all at the virtual data gallery. Thanks again.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.